Disclaimer: this is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, events, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The clock struck 11:30 p.m. on a stormy night in the quiet, shadowy hills of Asheville, North Carolina. The usually peaceful streets were illuminated by intermittent flashes of lightning, followed by the deep growl of thunder. Tucked away in a modest but cozy house, Ethan and Lila, a young married couple, were unwinding after a long day. Lila, a 25-year-old woman with an eye for beauty and precision, owned a small but thriving beauty salon that was the talk of their neighborhood. Ethan, on the other hand, lived for music, working as a DJ at parties and weddings, taking pride in crafting unforgettable moments through his art. Their story had begun on a musical note, literally. They had first met at an event Ethan was DJing, where Lila had gone with her friends. Sparks flew, as they often do in such settings, and soon their lives became intertwined. By 2018, after a few years of dating, they tied the knot in a simple courthouse wedding. Life seemed good, ordinary but content. They had built a life where dreams of small joys and shared struggles carried them forward. But this ordinary night would turn into something extraordinarily horrifying. Lila was preparing a late-night tea in the kitchen while Ethan flipped through a playlist for his upcoming gig. The rain outside created a rhythmic patter against the windows, a sound so constant that it almost muffled the faint scuffle outside their door. Suddenly, the door flew open with a deafening crash, shattering the fragile veneer of their peaceful lives. Three men, faces partially concealed with ski masks, shadows cast ominously by the dim light of the room, stormed inside. The chaos unfolded in a matter of seconds, leaving no time for Ethan or Lila to react. One of the intruders shouted, "She's over there," as he pointed toward Lila, who froze in terror, a steaming kettle trembling in her hands. The first gunshot rang out, shattering the quiet of the neighborhood. The bullet struck Lila in the shoulder, sending her sprawling onto the kitchen floor. Ethan, jolted by the shock, lunged forward in desperation, yelling, "Stop. What are you doing?" But before he could reach her, another shot echoed, this time aimed directly at her chest. Lila gasped, clutching her wound, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Ethan, driven by adrenaline, charged at one of the attackers, only to feel the searing pain of a bullet grazing his side. The force knocked him back onto the floor, and blood began to seep through his shirt. The men didn't linger. They had come for Lila, and their mission was complete. They turned and fled into the rain-soaked darkness as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind a scene of carnage. The sound of gunfire had shattered the stillness of the neighborhood, and soon curious and concerned neighbors gathered outside the couple's house. One of them, an older man named Robert, peered through the half-open door and recoiled at the sight of blood pooling on the floor. He shouted for help, and a few others braved their way inside. An ambulance was called, and within minutes, both Ethan and Lila were rushed to the nearest hospital. Lila, unconscious and barely clinging to life, was immediately taken into surgery. Ethan, though weak from blood loss, managed to stay awake long enough to be stabilized. Despite the best efforts of the medical team, Lila succumbed to her injuries in the early hours of the morning. Ethan, now a widower, was left with a gaping wound, not just in his body, but in his soul. The police quickly got involved, led by Detective Mark Harris, a seasoned investigator known for his sharp instincts and relentless pursuit of justice. The crime scene was cordoned off, and forensic teams worked through the night, collecting bullet casings, photographing blood spatters, and searching for any evidence that could provide a lead. When Ethan regained enough strength to speak, Detective Harris sat by his bedside with a notepad in hand. Ethan, his face pale and voice trembling, recounted the horrific events. 3 men broke into our house. They didn't say much, they just started shooting. Lila was their target, I'm sure of it. I tried to stop them, but one of them shot me too. Harris listened intently, scribbling notes. Ethan paused before adding one of them. I recognized him. His name is Ricky. His real name is Jason. He's my cousin. The revelation sent a ripple through the investigation. Harris's eyes narrowed. You're saying this man, someone related to you, attacked you and your wife? Why? Ethan shook his head weakly. I don't know why. I helped him in the past, gave him money when he needed it. I thought we were on good terms. I don't understand why he would do this. Harris's mind raced. The mention of a personal connection complicated the case. If Ricky was involved, what was his motive? And who were the other two men? As Ethan drifted off into an uneasy sleep, Harris knew one thing for certain. This wasn't a simple case of a home invasion gone wrong. This was personal. The investigation intensified. The police tracked down Ricky's known associates and began piecing together his history. What they uncovered painted a picture of greed, betrayal, and a trail of dark secrets that led straight back to Ethan and Lila's seemingly ordinary life. As the investigation deepened, Detective Mark Harris and his team delved into the possible motives behind Lila's brutal murder. When questioned, Ethan sat in his hospital bed, visibly weary but cooperative, recounting what he believed had led to the horrific attack. His voice was heavy with guilt and regret. Ethan explained, Ricky, whose real name is Jason, was my cousin. He was from Knoxville, Tennessee, and had a deeply troubled past. Growing up, Ricky fell into bad company. He became addicted to drugs and eventually started stealing to fund his addiction. His life spiraled out of control. He paused, looking down at his trembling hands as though the memories were too much to bear. In 2014, things got worse. Ricky got into a fight and he killed someone. He was arrested for murder. I remember the day I found out. It was shocking, but somehow he got out on bail within a year. Detective Harris's pen paused midair. How did he get bail so quickly in a murder case? He asked. Ethan shook his head. I don't know the details, but his family wanted nothing to do with him after that. They disowned him, and he had nowhere to go. That's when I decided to step in. I felt sorry for him, Detective. I thought he deserved a second chance. So I let him stay at my house for a while, and I even tried to find him a job. Ethan's face darkened as he continued. But Lila, she wasn't happy about it. She hated Ricky. She knew about his past and didn't trust him. She thought he was dangerous, and maybe she was right. We argued about it constantly. Lila would tell me, he's a criminal, Ethan. You're putting us in danger by keeping him here. Harris leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Did these arguments create tension between Lila and Ricky? Ethan nodded slowly. Yes, Ricky didn't like her at all. He used to say she was trying to turn me against him. I think he resented her. Deeply. Armed with this new information, the police began tracing Ricky's whereabouts. Their first lead took them to Knoxville, his hometown. Detective Harris dispatched a small team to Knoxville, where they first questioned Ricky's parents. The old couple seemed more exasperated than heartbroken. Ricky's father, a stern man in his 60s, said flatly, "We disowned him years ago. He brought nothing but shame to this family. We haven't seen him in over a year, and frankly, we don't care where he is." The mother, though slightly softer in demeanor, echoed the same sentiment. He was always in trouble, stealing, fighting. We couldn't take it anymore. He's not our son anymore. The police also questioned neighbors in the area. A few elderly women shook their heads and said, "Ricky? Oh, that boy? We haven't seen him in months. He used to roam around, but he's disappeared now. Good riddance, we say." Efforts to trace Ricky's mobile phone number hit a dead end as well. The device had been switched off for 10 months, leaving investigators with no way to track his movements. It was as though Ricky had vanished into thin air. Despite these challenges, Detective Harris wasn't about to give up. The team decided to revisit Ethan, hoping to unearth more clues. This time, they questioned not just Ethan, but also his neighbors, who might have noticed unusual activity on the night of the murder. One of the neighbors, an older man named Robert, spoke up. "I heard the gunshots that night. It was terrifying. We all ran out of our houses, but by the time we got there, the men were gone. I didn't see their faces, but they were wearing ski masks." Another neighbor, a woman named Susan, added, "I thought I saw a white SUV parked near their house earlier that evening, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe it was theirs?" Detective Harris's ears perked up at this detail. "A white SUV? Did you notice the make or the license plate?" Susan shook her head apologetically. "It was dark and I wasn't paying attention, but I'm sure it was white." The police also reviewed CCTV footage from the area. Cameras mounted on nearby shops and homes captured fragments of the night's events. Footage from around 11:30 p.m. showed three shadowy figures entering Ethan and Lila's house. They moved quickly, their faces obscured by ski masks, and stayed inside for about 5 minutes. Moments later, they were seen exiting the house and disappearing into the rain-soaked streets. While the footage corroborated Ethan's account of the attack, it posed another challenge. The resolution was poor, making it impossible to identify the suspects. The police could only make out their builds. One was tall and lean, another stockier, and the third appeared to be of medium height. Detective Harris stared at the grainy footage, his mind racing. These men were organized, he murmured to himself. They came prepared, knew their target, and didn't leave any obvious trail. As the investigation unfolded, the police began to piece together a more complex picture of Ethan and Lila's relationship. Their once-loving marriage seemed to have unraveled in recent months, with mounting tensions that had not gone unnoticed by their neighbors. Neighbors described frequent arguments emanating from Ethan and Lila's home. One elderly woman, Mrs. Thompson, who lived next door, recalled, "It used to be so peaceful here, but lately, we'd hear them fighting almost every other day. It was always about that man, Ricky. Lila didn't want him in the house, and Ethan kept defending him. You could tell things weren't right." Another neighbor, Robert, added, "Lila was a strong-willed woman, but Ethan seemed different lately. He looked tired, distracted. And the way they fought, it wasn't just normal husband-wife bickering. There was something deeper, something darker." This testimony painted a grim picture of domestic discord, fueling the police's suspicions that Ricky's involvement in the crime might have been linked to these tensions. But they weren't ready to jump to conclusions yet. The police decided to dig deeper into the couple's lives by examining their call records. Lila's call records didn't reveal anything out of the ordinary. Most of her calls were to her clients or suppliers for her beauty salon. However, Ethan's records raised eyebrows. Among the many phone numbers he had been in contact with, two stood out due to the frequency of communication. These numbers belonged to Derek and Greg, two individuals identified as close friends of Ethan. Curiously, neither Derek nor Greg had contacted Ethan since the night of the attack. Detective Harris found this particularly odd. If they're such close friends, wouldn't they have rushed to the hospital after hearing about the shooting? Or at least called to check on him, he pondered aloud to his team. The discrepancy was too glaring to ignore. The police summoned Derek and Greg for questioning, hoping to uncover the truth. When the two men arrived at the station, their demeanor was tense. Derek, a lanky man in his late 20s, fidgeted nervously, while Greg, stockier and slightly older, avoided eye contact altogether. The interrogation began with routine questions. The men claimed they hadn't been in touch with Ethan recently and insisted they were unaware of the incident. Derek claimed he had been out of town visiting relatives, while Greg said he had been attending a family function on the night of the shooting. But their stories didn't hold up for long. The police had already obtained their location data from their phone records, which showed that both men had been at their respective homes in Asheville on the night of the attack. When confronted with this evidence, their alibis crumbled. The pressure mounted. Detective Harris leaned in, his voice cold and steady. "We know you're lying. Your phone records place you in the city that night. Why don't you save us all some time and tell us the truth?" The men exchanged nervous glances. The room grew heavy with silence. Finally, under the weight of intense interrogation, they broke down. With trembling voices, Derek and Greg revealed the shocking truth. The entire plot to murder Lila had been orchestrated by Ethan himself. Derek, his hands shaking as he spoke, confessed it was all Ethan's idea. He suspected Lila of having an affair with someone from her beauty salon. He was convinced she was cheating on him. He was furious. Greg added he didn't want a divorce. He said it would ruin him financially and socially. He wanted her gone, but he wanted it to look like someone else had done it. A perfect murder, he called it. The confession sent shockwaves through the investigation team. The loving husband who had appeared to be a victim was now emerging as the mastermind behind his own wife's murder. According to Derek and Greg, Ethan had been planning the crime for months. He had carefully crafted a plan that would divert suspicion away from himself. Derek explained, "Ethan told us about Ricky's hatred for Lila. He said we could use that to our advantage. He even contacted Ricky a few months ago and told him Lila had been spreading rumors about him. Ethan knew how to provoke him." Greg added he made sure Ricky would be implicated. He planted the idea in Ricky's head that Lila was trying to ruin his life. And on the night of the attack, Ethan gave us the signal to act. He told us to make it quick and messy, to make it look like a revenge killing. The two men admitted that Ethan had promised them a hefty sum of money in exchange for their help. But after the crime, Ethan had gone silent, leaving them to fend for themselves. The police now faced the daunting task of corroborating this confession and gathering concrete evidence against Ethan. They revisited the crime scene, looking for anything that could tie Ethan to the planning of the murder. Meanwhile, Ethan remained in the hospital, unaware that his carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. For Ethan, the plan was more than just an act of desperation. It was an obsession. A year before Lila's murder, Ethan had begun immersing himself in crime shows, books, and real-life cases of murders that went unsolved for years. The intricate details of how perpetrators manipulated evidence, created alibis, and misled investigators fascinated him. He took notes, mentally cataloging every trick he thought could be useful. But Ethan wasn't just inspired, he was meticulous. He understood one fundamental lesson from all the stories he consumed. A successful crime always needed a scapegoat. Someone to take the fall, someone with just enough of a motive to keep the authorities distracted. Ethan's gaze fell on Ricky, his troubled cousin from Knoxville, Tennessee. With his drug addiction, criminal past, and disowned status, Ricky was perfect for Ethan's plan. No one would doubt that Ricky was capable of murder, especially if Ethan carefully laid the groundwork. Ethan began his plan by pretending to be the Good Samaritan. He reached out to Ricky in early 2018, offering to help him get his life back on track. Ethan invited Ricky to Asheville, giving him a place to stay and even some money to cover his basic needs. "Your family," Ethan would say, flashing a warm smile. "I can't stand to see you struggle." At first, Ricky was skeptical of Ethan's generosity, but over time, he began to trust him. Ethan even promised to help Ricky find a job in Nashville, away from the temptations of drugs and crime. This act of kindness cemented Ricky's faith in Ethan, making him believe that he had finally found someone who genuinely cared for him. While Ricky began to see Ethan as his savior, Ethan was secretly orchestrating his demise. He confided in his two closest friends, Derek and Greg, carefully explaining his plan. "This isn't just about me," Ethan argued during one of their secret meetings. "It's about getting rid of Lila, but it has to look perfect. Ricky's the perfect patsy, no one will question it." Both Derek and Greg were hesitant at first, but Ethan, ever the manipulator, knew how to play on their weaknesses. He offered them money and promised that their involvement would never come to light. Slowly, they became complicit in his scheme. By late 2018, Ethan's plan moved into its next phase. On the pretext of helping Ricky secure a job, Ethan convinced him to travel to Nashville. Derek and Greg accompanied them, posing as friends eager to help Ricky start fresh. The group arrived at a remote location, a desolate stretch of forested land far from prying eyes. Ricky, naive and desperate for change, didn't suspect a thing. That night, Ethan lured Ricky into a false sense of celebration, buying alcohol and insisting they toast to a new beginning. Ricky drank eagerly, unaware that Ethan had spiked his drink with a sedative. As the night wore on, Ricky's speech slurred, and his movements became sluggish. Ethan, Derek, and Greg waited until Ricky was completely incapacitated before making their move. With chilling precision, the three men strangled Ricky. Derek and Greg held him down while Ethan tightened a rope around his neck. Ricky's struggles grew weaker and weaker until his body finally went limp. The trio stripped Ricky of all identifying items, his clothes, wallet, and documents. They left him in his undergarments to ensure that no one would be able to recognize him. They then dumped his body in a dense part of the forest, confident that the elements and scavengers would render him unidentifiable within days. Before leaving, Ethan scattered a few items, a broken liquor bottle, a cigarette pack, and some trash, to make it seem like Ricky had been killed in a drunken altercation. "No one will ever trace this back to us," Ethan assured his accomplices. 10 months passed. The news of Ricky's disappearance never made headlines, and Ethan's confidence in his plan grew. He was now ready to execute the second and final phase, Lila's murder. On the night of August 29, 2019, Ethan orchestrated every detail with clinical precision. Derek and Greg arrived at his house wearing black masks and gloves to avoid leaving any evidence behind. Ethan had instructed them to make the scene look chaotic and violent, just as they had done in Nashville. At 11:30 p.m., Derek and Greg burst into Ethan's house, armed with guns. They fired indiscriminately, aiming at Lila while she screamed in terror. Ethan, playing his role as the innocent husband, pretended to fight back. In the scuffle, Greg fired a shot that grazed Ethan's side, leaving a superficial wound that added credibility to his story. As Lila lay bleeding on the floor, Ethan staggered to the door, shouting for help. Derek and Greg fled the scene, disappearing into the night. Ethan collapsed dramatically near the doorway, ensuring the neighbors would see him as a victim of the attack. When the neighbors rushed in, they found Ethan injured and Lila critically wounded. The site was chaotic, blood pooled on the floor, furniture overturned, and bullet holes riddling the walls. The police were called immediately, and both Ethan and Lila were rushed to the hospital. While Lila succumbed to her injuries, Ethan's superficial wound was treated quickly, and he was declared stable. From his hospital bed, Ethan spun his carefully crafted tale. 3 masked intruders had broken in, and one of them, he claimed, was his cousin Ricky. Ethan's performance was flawless. He cried, raged, and expressed grief over Lila's death, all while maintaining that Ricky was the mastermind. The police, initially swayed by his emotional display, began their hunt for Ricky, a man they didn't know was already dead. But as cracks in Ethan's story began to surface, the police would soon uncover the horrifying truth. The murder of Lila was no crime of passion, but the culmination of a cold, calculated plan, a plan that Ethan had orchestrated to perfection. If you enjoyed this thrilling murder mystery, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more gripping stories and suspenseful content. Your support keeps the mystery alive.